As the end of World War I drew near, the German Empire was in ruin. While not yet officially defeated, the realities of war were evident in the German streets in the fall of 1918. However, it was an attempted coup 5 years later that would ultimately send the country into its darkest chapter. This is the haunting history of Hitler's failed coup. As the war ravaged on, the German people were starving, raw materials were running low, sailors mutinied, and others revolted. With these issues looming large and the army quickly losing steam, German leaders agreed to an armistice, which was signed on November 11, 1918, and the men who signed it would soon gain the name the November Criminals. Some within the German military believed this agreement was a stab in the back by civilian politicians, and that German forces were undefeated and victory still possible, despite the sobering reality of the situation. In the wake of the ceasefire and the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II, a new government was formed in 1919 known as the Weimar Republic. The new Republican government ushered in positive things like the right to vote for men and women over the age of 20, equality for all citizens, freedom of speech and religion, and the election of government officials by the people. However, as with any new system, issues arose. In the case of electing German parliament known as Reichstag, seats were distributed proportionally to the number of votes a party received. This resulted in numerous parties being elected to the Reichstag, making a majority all but impossible to achieve. Instead, coalitions of parties formed in order to control the government. However, it was difficult for these coalitions to accomplish much due to the disagreements between parties within each coalition. The Republic would face attempts by both the left and right side to overthrow the government. At the same time, a new political party formed in the German state of Bavaria, which would ultimately bring the new Weimar Republic to an end just 14 years later. Munich locksmith Anton Drexler formed a party called the German Workers' Party. Shortly after its formation, a soldier who had recently recovered from a mustard gas attack attended one of the meetings and would become the party's 55th member in September 1919. This soldier was 30-year-old Adolf Hitler. Using his notorious speech skills and magnetism, Hitler quickly built a name for himself within the party. By 1920, the party had become renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, aka the Nazi Party, and Hitler, having left the army, was running propaganda. In July 1921, Hitler became the leader and membership flourished. By the beginning of 1923, the Nazi Party had some 20,000 members. Meanwhile, the country as a whole was struggling under the Treaty of Versailles. Signed in June 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference, the treaty ended the war, but the Allies also surprised German delegates with harsh new clauses that had not been agreed upon in the previous armistice. They disputed the differences, particularly the War Guilt Clause, which stated that Germany was the aggressor in the war and therefore was responsible for all losses and damages sustained by the Allies as part of the war and were required to pay reparations. While a true figure for all the damage caused in the war would be impossible to calculate, a sum of 33 billion was ultimately decided upon, and the Allies were allowed to take punitive measures if Germany did not keep up with payments. A task made even more difficult with the reduction of Germany's territory and population, which impacted their industrial income. It would take until 2010 for Germany to make its final reparations payment. Despite all this, Germany had no choice but to agree, albeit under protest. Many Germans were appalled by the treaty, and its looming impact, including hyperinflation, would only add fuel to the fire. The belief that government officials had betrayed the German people would gain popularity, especially with the Nazi Party. Hitler would use this stab-in-the-back legend as propaganda in his speeches, weakening the government in the eyes of the people. In January 1923, French and Belgian forces occupied the industrial Ruhr Valley region of Germany because the country had fallen behind on its reparation payments, and France wanted to recuperate what it was owed, believing that Germany was withholding payments. A claim disputed by the German government, which argued they were unable to afford it. Instead of simply allowing occupation, workers were ordered by the federal government to resist passively by not working and therefore not producing goods that could be taken as reparations. The workers, however, still needed to be paid, so the government began printing more paper money to pay them, throwing the German currency into freefall and causing hyperinflation. It's said the price of people's meals would change while they were eating in restaurants. Some workers were paid twice a day, as the value of their wages plummeted by the hour. In July, $1 was worth 160,000 marks. But in November, 4.2 trillion marks equaled just $1. The middle class was hit hardest. Their savings became worthless as inflation increased. People resorted to bartering as money became meaningless. By September, the country was in such disarray that the Chancellor of Germany called for the end of passive resistance, which upset nationalists, who were numerous in Bavaria. In reaction to this, Gustav Ritter von Kahr was made the state commissioner in Bavaria and was given dictatorial power. He resisted orders from the Reich and persuaded General Otto von Lossow, the commander of the local Reich army, to ignore orders from Berlin as well. With the Bavarians' distrust and dislike for the Republic growing and the volatile state of Bavarian government, Hitler saw this as his time to strike, launching his Beer Hall Putsch. On the evening of November 8th, Commissioner Kahr and other Bavarian leaders were holding a rally at a beer hall in Munich, the Bürgerbräu Keller. Hitler planned to interrupt the rally and announce that the Bavarian government had been overthrown. Once the Nazis controlled Bavaria, they could march on Berlin and overthrow the federal government, emulating the March on Rome conducted by Italian dictator Benito Mussolini just the year before. While Hitler was the leader of a growing political group in Bavaria, he was hardly known on the national stage before the coup, let alone internationally. Hitler, along with 600 members of the Nazis' soldier group, the Sturmabteilung, also known as stormtroopers or brown shirts, descended on the beer hall around 8:30 p.m. There Hitler found Kahr, along with General von Lossow and Colonel von Seisser, head of Bavarian police. Kahr was giving a speech to the crowd denouncing Marxism when Hitler arrived. Upon his entry, Hitler fired his gun into the ceiling, interrupting the rally and declaring the beginning of a national revolution. He made his way to the front of the crowd, addressing them quickly before pushing Kahr, Lossow, and Seisser into a back room. There he threatened the men at gunpoint to support his mission. Once he received the support of the trio, the group went back into the hall, announcing the revolution to the crowd. The men publicly stated their support of Hitler's plan, and the new leaders of the Bavarian government were named. Commander-in-chief was General Erich Ludendorff, a firm believer in the stab-in-the-back legend and co-conspirator of Hitler, who participated in a previous putsch in Berlin. Hitler was to be Ludendorff's political advisor, and Lossow was now the Minister of Defense. Once Hitler got what he came for, the support of the Bavarian leaders, he exited the beer hall to check in on other areas of the city. The stormtroopers made their way to the army headquarters and local papers, taking over communication within the city. Left with Ludendorff, the Bavarian leaders convinced him that they needed to take their leave from the hall to start their new positions in the freshly formed regime. Ludendorff allowed them to do so, which was a grave mistake, as the leaders denounced Hitler's plans as soon as they were free. Yet another mistake was made when the stormtroopers failed to overtake several important centers needed to maintain their control of the city's communications. Because of this, the Bavarian leaders were able to call for reinforcements that would meet Hitler and his troops on the streets in the following day. The next morning, Hitler, Ludendorff, members of other nationalist groups, and 2,000 stormtroopers marched through Munich on their way to Feldherrenhalle, hoping to rally citizens with this grand display. As they approached Odeonsplatz, they were met by the Bavarian state police, who opened fire. All in all, 14 of the Nazis and 4 policemen died in the conflict at the square. 2 additional Nazis would be killed in other parts of Munich. Hitler obviously made it out alive, save for an injury to his arm. Some report he came as close as 2 feet from his own death. He managed to escape the clash and evade capture for 2 days until he was finally seized at a villa outside of Munich. In March 1924, Hitler would come before a 5-judge panel along with co-conspirators. The lead judge of the trial was lenient with him, not unlike the treatment given to many right-wing people during the Weimar Republic. Defendants would often say they were acting out of patriotism, and Hitler was no exception. He stated that by signing the Treaty of Versailles, the government had betrayed the German people. In April, Hitler would be sentenced to the minimum for high treason, just 5 years in prison. But in the end, he would only serve about 8 to 9 months in a cushy minimum security prison, leaving in December of the same year. The leniency of such sentencing was criticized on both sides. He was not allowed to speak in public until 1927-28. Additionally, the Nazi Party, along with its formations and newspaper, was banned, but that ban was lifted in 1925. His time at Landsberg am Lech prison turned out to be incredibly productive for the future dictator, as he built up his self-confidence and transformed himself into the monstrous figure we know today. It was during this time he wrote part of his infamous manifesto, Mein Kampf, the first volume of which he dictated to his personal secretary, who was also imprisoned with him on charges of high treason. Additionally, Hitler was afforded comforts including wearing civilian clothes, sending and receiving letters, and meeting with any inmates he wanted to. The Beer Hall Putsch made Hitler realize that an overthrow or revolution was not likely to land him in power. Instead, he decided to go the legitimate and democratic route and began organizing in order to assume power from within the system. It would take him just 10 years to achieve this goal. On January 30th, 1933, Hitler was named Chancellor of Germany, marking the end of the Weimar Republic. He established dictatorial power by March of that year, when the Nazis and other parties in the Reichstag voted to give him power to make decrees without support from the Reichstag and presidency. On August 2, 1934, the death of President Paul von Hindenburg would present Hitler with the opportunity to merge the roles of Chancellor and President, giving Hitler the command of the military. Once this occurred, those in armed forces took an oath of loyalty to Hitler, and he solidified his role as Führer. Hitler would rule Nazi Germany for 12 years, committing countless atrocities and horrifically murdering over 11 million people, including 6 million Jews. While the threat of the Beer Hall Putsch felt like it came to a swift end in 1923, history proved that it was just the beginning of the terror Hitler would unleash on the country in the coming years. Knowing this, it is perhaps wise to remember that the threat from those outside of the system is not what should scare us. It is the threat from within that is much more terrifying.